The afternoon in the Wild West passed like a pale golden dream. The late afternoon sun cast a soft glow over the desert, making the sand sparkle like shards of glass. Ethan Cole sat on his horse, his hands loosely gripping the reins, his eyes half closed. The wind blew through his hair and face, carrying the scent of dry earth and dead grass. Ahead, the line of carriages followed one another, the creaking of the wheels and the sound of the horse bells blending into a slow rhythm, making him feel as if the whole world was lulling him to sleep. In the distance, the purple mountains were like shadows, slowly drifting by in the late afternoon sunlight. The sky was so high and vast that it dwarfed humans, and Ethan felt that he was just a grain of sand in this vast sea of earth and sky. He took a sip of water from his skin bag. The warm water tasted of sand, but it was as precious as gold. Then the wind changed direction. A faint gray streak appeared on the horizon, stretching like ink on gold. Ethan squinted. A small unease rose in his chest. He had heard of dust storms in the west. They came suddenly, swallowing entire groups before anyone could find shelter. The wind picked up, and the first grains of sand stung his face. A shout from ahead shattered the silence. Storm! Dust storm! The whole caravan was in chaos. Horses whinnied, the cars rocked. But there was no place to hide in the desert. In an instant, the sky seemed to pour down a thick yellow curtain. The dust swirled in swirling columns, swallowing the sunlight, swallowing the caravan, and swallowing Ethan into its embrace. The horse galloped forward in panic. Ethan crouched low, closed his eyes, felt the sand in his hair, in his collar, in his mouth. The wind howled like 100 monsters roaring above him. He had no idea where he was going, only the pounding of his heart and the choking of his breath. A jolt threw him from the saddle. His body hit the hard sand, rolling several times. His shoulders ached, his mouth was full of sand, his eyes stung. When he looked up, everything was gone. No wagons. No horses. Just a sea of dust and the howling wind. He sat up, breathing hard, his heart pounding. In that moment, Ethan realized he was completely lost. The desert stretched on forever, and he was just a speck, left alone in this vast, cold world. The wind had died down, but the desert after the dust storm was like another world. There was no more creaking of wheels, no more human chatter, just absolute silence, so heavy Ethan could hear his heart beating. Tiny grains of sand still hung in the air, drifting like a golden mist. Ethan stood up, brushing sand from his coat and hair, feeling as if he had just emerged from the bowels of a giant monster. He turned slowly, trying to find a sign of the convoy. There was nothing but rolling dunes to the horizon. The wind blew gently, but with a deep loneliness, as if he were the only one left in the world. He walked. His first steps left a mark on the soft sand, then disappeared behind him as the wind blew. He tried to follow the direction he thought the convoy had gone, but all traces were erased. Each step felt heavier because of the feeling of hopelessness. In that moment, he suddenly thought, if I keep walking, will the desert swallow me without anyone knowing? As the sun began to set, the last light spread across the sand, turning it into ripples of orange and gold. The distant purple peaks seemed to drift closer, but as Ethan walked toward them, they still felt far away. He stopped, took the water skin, and took a small sip. The water was warm, with a distinct taste of sand, but it went down his throat like a comfort. He knew he had to save every drop, because no one knew what tomorrow would bring. Night fell quickly. A vast purple-blue blanket covered the desert, giving way to the first stars. The night wind was cold and dry, but gentler than the day. Ethan found a low rock jutting from the sand and leaned against it. The coolness of the rock seeped through his thin clothes, sending shivers down his spine. He pulled his hood lower and looked up at the sky. The night sky here was like an inverted ocean, clear and deep, sprinkled with sparkling silver particles. The stars were quiet and distant, but at this moment, they were his only friends. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the night wind carry the scent of dry earth and unfamiliar tree sap into his lungs. A howl echoed from somewhere far away. Ethan opened his eyes and looked around, his heart beating faster. The howl was not threatening, but a lonely call in the night. Then another howl answered, Farther away, deeper. The desert began to play its own lullaby, wind rustling, insects chirping, and the long, drawn-out cry of wolves. Ethan told himself he would be okay. He pulled the gun closer to his hip and closed his eyes again. The wind was a whisper, lulling him into a fitful sleep. In his dream, he found himself back in the old town, hearing the church bells, smelling the smell of baking bread from the kitchen window. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the desert, the stars, and a silence so gentle it was almost lulling. When Ethan woke up, the pale light of dawn was already spreading across the desert. It was still early, the sun only partially rising, its soft amber light sliding across the sand, making it sparkle like a thin layer of gold. He slowly sat up, his whole body aching from a night of sleeping on the cold sand. His throat was dry, and his first breath of the morning carried the smell of dust and the faint taste of iron from his own tired body. He opened the water bag. There was less than half of it left. Ethan sat still for a moment, listening to his heart, then took a small sip. The water was warm and slightly bitter, but it flowed down his throat like magic, bringing him some clarity. He knew that the most important thing today was to find a water source. Otherwise, this could be his last day in the desert. He stood up and looked around. The darkness of the night had hidden the terrible emptiness of the place. Now, as the sun rose, the desert opened before him like an endless golden sea, rippled by sand dunes and dotted with barren thorn bushes. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, as if he had never been with the caravan yesterday. Ethan chose a direction with undulating rocks, because he knew where rocks could hold shade and sometimes even small pools of water. He walked slowly, each step seemed to sink into time, leaving temporary traces on the sand. The morning wind was light, carrying the chill of the night that had not yet dissipated, and the smell of fresh earth after a dust storm. After a while, he saw faint prints in the sand, not human footprints, but animal footprints. He bent down and looked closely. The footprints were small and pointed, probably those of a wolf or a wild dog. He remembered the howling of the night before, and his heart skipped a beat. Wolves needed water to survive. If he followed these footprints, he might find a source of water or at least some shade where they could hide. The sun rose higher. The heat began to press down on his back like an invisible blanket, growing heavier with each passing hour. Sweat beaded, leaving salty streaks on his neck and forehead. He saw a small hollow in a low ravine, and he approached it and bent down. There was only a shallow pool of water, mixed with sand and dead insects. Ethan used a cloth to strain the water, patiently pouring each drop into a leather bag. He took a small sip and closed his eyes. The water felt cooler than in his old bag, and his body felt alive again. He told himself, "I am alive, at least for today." In the afternoon, Ethan found a patch of dry thorn bushes. He gathered up broken branches and started a small fire. The thin smoke billowed up, carrying the smell of burning wood and desert dust, like a message to the sky that there was still a human being here. He dried his towel and shoes, feeling the warmth of the fire creep into his palms. In that moment, the loneliness seemed to soften, giving way to a strange peace. As the sky darkened, Ethan heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He turned slowly. In the twilight, a small, thin figure appeared, a wolf pup, its fur silver gray, its eyes glowing like two weak flames. It stood a few meters away, not growling, just watching him with wary, curious eyes. Ethan did not move. The fire between the two strange creatures became a thin line between fear and trust. In that moment he felt something strange. In the middle of this vast desert, two lonely people saw each other, and were no longer completely alone. Night fell, the fire crackled, and the distant howl sounded, mixed with the wind, creating a sad lullaby of the Wild West. Ethan leaned back against the rock, closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of the night lull him into a short sleep, in this harsh yet gentle land. Ethan was greeted by a second desert morning of harsh white light and an eerie silence. The sun rose over the horizon like an eye slowly opening, revealing every ripple of fine sand. The early morning wind was dry and light, blowing tiny grains of sand across his skin, carrying with it the earthy scent left over from the previous day's storm. Ethan rose from his resting place by the ashes of the campfire. His body was stiff from a restless night's sleep, and every movement brought a soft creak from his joints. He inhaled deeply, feeling the desert sand in his breath. His water bag was rapidly emptying. His mind was on a single goal: to keep going and to find someone, or at least a trace of someone. He chose to follow the sandy slopes to the southwest, where the pale purple mountains appeared like a distant blur. The soft sand swallowed every step, leaving faint imprints. Occasionally, a light wind would pass by and erase them, as if he had never been there. The feeling of the desert, swallowing every trace of his existence, made his heart heavy. By midday, the heat was becoming unbearable. Sweat soaked into his shirt, drying quickly in the hot sun, leaving white salt stains on his shoulders. Ethan squinted, looking around. In the distance, he saw something glinting in the sunlight, a glint of metal. His heart fluttered, and his steps quickened involuntarily. But as he got closer, the light was just a shimmering surface of water on hot sand. A mirage. Ethan stopped, head bowed, a wry smile on his lips. The desert was testing him, drawing daydreams to pull him away from reality. He continued walking, his breathing growing heavier. At times, he thought he could hear the distant sound of hooves and the creaking of wheels. He stopped and looked up to listen. There was only the rustling of the wind and the pounding of his heart in his chest. The feeling of loneliness grew, like an invisible blanket of sand wrapped around his body. As the sun began to drift west, Ethan noticed something new: footprints. They were faint, stretching in a curve across the dunes. He had no idea how old they were, but they were enough to give him reason to continue. A faint hope flared in his chest, like a small flame in the long night. He followed the footprints until the afternoon shadows fell. The dunes were now a reddish-orange, the light softer and gentler, making everything seem like a sad dream. The wind caressed Ethan's tanned face, and in that moment, he heard a call from deep within him, an urge to keep walking, to keep searching, because to stop would mean to disappear into silence. The second night fell. Ethan found a high mound to rest on, from where he could see the early stars appearing in the purple sky. As he lay down, he felt as if he were floating between two worlds, the deep sky above and the endless sea of sand below. And at the intersection of these two vastnesses, he was just a small creature, lulled to sleep by the breath of the desert. The third day's dawn filtered through dusty lashes, waking Ethan with a soft but unforgiving brightness. He opened his eyes and saw that the sky had turned paler, a silvery blue stretching to the horizon. The morning wind was light and cool, carrying the scent of dry sand, reminding him that he was still alive, but his body felt as if it had been crushed. He rose slowly, his legs aching and his head a little light with thirst. His water bladder was less than a third full, and his stomach was empty. He chewed a piece of the jerky, let it soften in his mouth, then swallowed slowly. The taste was salty and sandy, but it was life. He continued to follow the footsteps he had seen yesterday. The sand was getting hotter under his feet, and the sun seemed to be rising faster than usual. His footsteps on the sand formed a familiar rhythm: rustle, 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 in the silence of the sea and sky. Every time the wind blew, he heard the faint rustle of his coat and hat, like a sad lullaby of the desert. By midday, as the sun began to press down on his shoulders, Ethan saw a thin line of smoke rising from behind a mound. He squinted, his heart slowing a beat. This time, he couldn't believe his eyes so soon. But as he drew closer, he caught the scent of burning wood and roasting meat on the wind. He walked slowly, crouching low, quietly rounding a mound of earth. Before him was a scene that seemed straight out of a dream, a small hut made of skins and branches, beside which was a red, smoking fire, and a native man squatting, roasting meat on a stick. The man wore a dark leather jacket, had long black hair, a sunburnt face, and eyes as sharp as stone. Ethan stepped out, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm lost." His voice was hoarse, dry, as if it hadn't been used all day. The native said nothing, just looked at him for a long moment, then gestured for him to sit down by the fire. Ethan did so, feeling the heat of the fire warm his cold hands after the long night. The man handed him a leather water jug. Ethan took a small sip, the cool water running down his throat, making his eyes water with pleasure. After a moment of silence, the native spoke in a deep voice, English mixed with a local accent. The desert spares no one in a hurry. You are still alive because it does not want to marry you yet. Ethan nodded, taking in every word as if it were a lesson engraved into his bones. The man showed him how to read the wind to find water, how to look for animal tracks to know if there was shade and food nearby. He showed him how to break thorns into hooks to hang water from, and how to start a fire with nothing but flint and dry branches. As the evening wore on, the two of them sat together, watching the sun set behind the distant purple mountains. Ethan had never felt so still. In that moment, the desert was no longer a harsh enemy, but an ancient being whispering its secrets. And now, he was learning to listen. The night fire danced before Ethan's eyes, casting a warm orange glow that reflected off the sand and cast long, trembling shadows across the desert floor. The scent of burning wood and roasting meat mingled with the scent of dry earth, creating a scent of life, something he had thought he would never taste again all day. The native sat across from him, silent for a long moment before speaking. "What's your name?" "Ethan. Ethan Cole." He answered, his voice hoarse but softer after drinking water. The man nodded, his eyes still on the fire. He didn't say his name, but Ethan felt that names didn't matter in this place. In the desert, humans were just small creatures borrowing the breath of the earth and sky to survive. They ate in silence. The steak was dry and tough, but to Ethan it was the most satisfying meal of his life. He chewed slowly, letting the smoke and charred meat melt on his tongue. With each swallow, he felt his body gain strength, and his hands stopped shaking. When his belly was warmed, the native began to tell his story. His voice was low and rhythmic, as if in tune with the wind rustling in the dunes. He said that this desert was once a sea of water, a place where gods and men once met. The wind was the whisper of lost souls, and the stars in the sky were watchful eyes for those who forgot they were only passers-by. Ethan sat listening, his head nodding along to the story, feeling dreamy as if he were drifting in a dream. The fire crackled, the red embers glowing like little stars falling to the ground. He looked up at the sky, endless, blue-black, sprinkled with shimmering silver. A wolf howled somewhere in the distance, and another answered, lower and closer. Ethan shivered, but then felt strangely safe beside the fire. The native took a short bone flute from his leather bag and played a slow, sad tune. The sound was soft as mist, carried on the wind, drifting among the sand dunes, mingling with the sound of the fire, the whistling wind, and the whispering night. Ethan felt his eyelids grow heavy, his heart slow. In that moment, it seemed like the desert was no longer an enemy but a giant hammock, lulling him into a fitful sleep, lulling him with the music of the earth and sky. Before falling asleep, Ethan heard the deep voice of the native one last time. Remember, here, those who listen live. Those who forget to listen disappear as if they had never existed. And in the wind, that sentence seemed to spread, repeating over and over across the sand, until it became an endless lullaby. The next dawn came slowly and quietly. When Ethan opened his eyes, the sky was still dotted with faint stars, and the horizon was just a pale pink. The sand beneath him was cold and damp, as if the desert itself had just slept. He breathed deeply, his lungs filled with the scent of dry earth and the ashes of last night's fires. The native was up early. He was checking the tracks around the tent, his footsteps so light that they barely left a mark in the sand. Ethan propped himself up on his elbows, his eyes still heavy from the lingering sound of the flute and the wind from last night. The man gave him a piece of dried meat and half a bag of water. "Today you will learn to go with the desert, not against it." Ethan nodded, chewing the meat slowly. As the sun rose, a soft golden light spread across the dunes, and the wind soon began to blow. The native pointed in the direction of the wind. "Here, the wind carries all the answers. The wind carries the scent of water, the scent of animals, and even the scent of people. Learn to smell, listen, and see with your whole body." They set off. Ethan's steps were still heavy, but his breathing had improved thanks to a few precious sips of water. The natives walked slowly but surely, eyes constantly scanning the horizon and the sand. Whenever he stopped, he pointed out things Ethan hadn't noticed before: a clump of short grass leaning to one side that signaled underground water, a pale streak of animal bones that pointed to a safe path, or faint footprints that disappeared between two dunes. When the sun began to heat up, they found a shady crevice in the rock. The native took a small knife and skillfully cut a piece of dry bone to make a tube to scoop water from the crevice. The few but clear drops of water fell into the leather bag, making a musical sound. Ethan drank small sips, feeling the coolness spread throughout his body. In the afternoon, the wind picked up. In the sky, thin white clouds drifted lazily, casting shadows on the orange sand dunes. The native stopped, took a deep breath, and said, "Tomorrow, if you want, I will show you how to find your way back to the people. But first, you must learn how to make the desert accept you." That night, they lit the fire again. Ethan sat and watched the sparks shoot into the dark sky, blending with the endless sea of stars. The night wind rustled through the brambles, carrying an ancient melody he was beginning to recognize now. For the first time since he had been separated from the group, Ethan no longer felt afraid. Instead, he felt as if he were lying in the vast arms of a gentle giant, listening to the desert heart beat slow, steady, and warm. He closed his eyes, let his breath mingle with the wind, and let the night lull him with a song that could only be heard in the wildest places of the West. The next day, Ethan woke up feeling lighter, though the dull ache in his joints remained. The morning sky had turned a clear blue, the sun was not yet harsh, and the early wind brushed through his hair like cool fingers. The smell of last night's fire still lingered on his shirt, reminding him that he was still alive, still warm. The native stood on a dune, his eyes on the horizon. As Ethan approached, he pointed to the southeast. There, amid the endless waves of sand, was a darker stripe, like a faint blue. "There is life there," he said, his voice low and steady. "People, or at least water." They set off. Ethan had learned to walk with the desert, walking slowly, steadily, and quietly. He watched the wind, watched the sand, and listened for the slightest sound. Every now and then, the native would pick up a dry branch, stick it straight into the sand to measure the wind, and then continue walking. At noon, they rested in a shady hollow of rock. Ethan took a sip of water, then leaned back against the rock, looking out at the sea of sand that was reflecting the dazzling light. The desert no longer seemed to him as terrifying as before, but as a giant body breathing slowly, gently but patiently. As the afternoon wore on, as the sun slanted westward, they began to see the first signs. Some bushes were larger than usual, birds circled and landed in a certain direction. Ethan felt his heart beat faster, but the native only said softly, "Don't be too happy. The desert always tests the hasty." They walked a long way, and then Ethan heard a new sound, the faint trickling of water. He stopped, holding his breath. The native nodded, his eyes shining with satisfaction. They turned into a crevice where a small stream of water trickled through the rocks, clear and cool. Ethan knelt down and sipped the water, feeling as if all the thirst and fear of the past few days had melted away with the stream. As they rested by the water, dusk spread across the desert. A soft orange-red glow dyed the dunes into a sea of soft fire. Ethan sat there, watching his shadow stretch across the sand, and realized that the desert was no longer a place that wanted to kill him. It had become a part of his memory, a place he would remember with awe and gratitude. That night, as the stars filled the sky, Ethan knew that tomorrow he would find humanity again. But he also knew that a part of his soul would forever remain here, where he had learned to listen to the wind, the rhythm of the earth, and the silence of his heart. The dawn that day opened like a soft light curtain, gently pulled back from the pale blue sky. The early morning wind was cool and dry, carrying the scent of new earth and the scent of resinous trees from a distant place. Ethan opened his eyes, feeling for the first time in days that his body no longer felt as heavy as stone. Sleeping by the water and shade had given him new life. The native stood nearby, silently scanning the horizon. When Ethan approached, he said nothing, just nodded ahead. The direction seemed clearer today. The wind carried unusual sounds, distant but distinct, like the clanging of metal and human voices echoing across the sand. Ethan took a deep breath. A strange feeling rose in his heart, half eager, half regretful. The days lost in the desert, seemingly abandoned in a world without human voices, had made him accustomed to the slow pace of life, to the long breaths of the earth and the sky. Leaving this place, he knew, was also leaving a silence that he would never encounter again. They walked slowly, following the gentle slopes of the dunes that led down to the lowlands. As noon approached, the colors of the world began to change. In the distance, a strip of reddish-brown appeared, not sand, but dirt and rocks mixed with bushes, signs of familiar life. A thin column of smoke rose against the sky, and the sound of dogs barking echoed in the distance, clearly no longer an illusion. Ethan stood still for a long moment. He saw a strip of wood and canvas rising on the horizon, a small pioneering station. There were moving figures, wagons, and horses tied under the shade of the porch. He swallowed, his throat feeling both thirsty and tight. The native stopped behind, not taking another step. He looked at Ethan, his eyes as calm as the sand last night. "That's enough. You can go the next road yourself." Ethan turned around, his lips trembling slightly. "I don't know how to thank you." The man shook his head, his voice low and slow. "Remember what the earth and wind have taught you. Don't forget to listen to the breathing of the world." They looked at each other for a long moment in silence. Then the native turned and walked back across the sand, his figure soon merging with the bright sunlight, disappearing as if he had never existed. Ethan took a deep breath, then turned toward the station. With each step, he heard in his head the rustling of the wind from the previous nights, the crackling of the fire, and the howling of distant wolves. When he stepped onto solid ground, it felt like he had crossed an invisible line, from a world of solitude and silence back into the familiar sounds of people and life. Before entering the crowded area, Ethan stopped and looked back at the desert one last time. The golden sand stretched out, sparkling in the sun, so beautiful that it both tightened his heart and calmed his soul. He knew that no matter how far he went, a part of his soul would always remain there, where he had learned to slow down, listen, and find himself in the vast silence. Mornings at the Wild West station had a scent unlike any other in the desert: smoke from stoves, burning wood, and hay from the stables. Ethan stood under the old porch, watching the pioneers go about their daily business, lighting fires, tending horses, mending wagon wheels. The sounds of people talking, laughing, and the clop of horseshoes echoed throughout the small plot of land. Just a few days ago, those sounds had seemed to have disappeared from his world forever. A woman brought him a bowl of hot porridge. Ethan bowed his head in thanks, inhaling the aroma of the freshly cooked food. As the first spoonful of porridge slid down his throat, warmth spread throughout his body, making him realize how tired his body was. But between the sweetness of the grains and the slight saltiness of the salt, he suddenly felt that something was missing: the smell of dry soil, the rustling sound of the desert wind. After resting and regaining his strength, Ethan stepped outside and walked a short distance to the station gate. There, the desert still stretched endlessly, the golden sand shimmering in the morning sun. He stood still, letting the wind brush past his face and hair, carrying with it vague sounds that only he could hear: the crackling of the night fire, the howling of wolves, the bone flutes of the natives, and the slow breathing of the earth and sky. In that moment, he closed his eyes and imagined himself lying on the sand under the moonlit sky, the stars filling the sky, the wind singing ancient songs that only those who know how to listen can feel. The desert was like a friend, both harsh and gentle, teaching him an unforgettable lesson: to survive, one must learn to listen and slow down in this world. Ethan opened his eyes, took a last breath of dry air, then turned and walked back towards the people, the temporary roofs, and the old rhythm of life. But he knew deep down that he had left a part of his soul in that sea of sand, a place where the night lulled him with the sound of the wind, a place where the silence was so vast that he could hear his own heartbeat. From now on, every time the wind blows through your life, no matter where you are, you will remember the Wild West, where you were lost, where you were afraid, and where you were lulled to sleep in the invisible arms of the desert.